A billionaire saved a strange woman who collapsed in front of his house. The next day, the billionaire secretly took a blood sample from the girl to... Rain slashed against the cracked window pane, a relentless tattoo that blurred the world outside into streaks of grey. Inside the small, dimly lit room, Dorothy kneeled by the fraying edge of an old sofa, her hands steady as she adjusted a thin quilt around her son. Mark, just 7 years old, but with the pale, gaunt face of someone much older, stirred weakly, his breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. "Is it still raining, Mum?" His voice was barely a whisper, each word pulled out of him like a laborious task. Dorothy glanced at the window, where rivulets of water tracked erratically across the glass. "It's just a little rain," she replied, keeping her tone light. "It'll stop soon. Then maybe we can go out and look for that rainbow you love so much." Mark didn't smile, but his eyelids fluttered as if conjuring the image. He turned his face toward her, his cheek sinking deeper into the worn pillow. "Do you think it'll have all the colors this time?" Dorothy's throat tightened, but she managed a small laugh. "Every single one. Even the colors you can't imagine yet." She tucked the quilt closer around him, brushing his sweat-dampened hair from his forehead. Her fingers lingered there, cool against his fevered skin. She couldn't ignore the way his tiny frame seemed to shrink beneath her touch, as if the weight of his illness was physically pulling him inward, piece by piece. The room smelled faintly of menthol and something metallic, a reminder of the medicine she rationed carefully, measuring each drop like it was liquid gold. Beside the sofa, an old tin cup sat on the floor, the remnants of Mark's tea untouched. It had been days since he could stomach more than a sip of anything. "Mom," his voice broke her thoughts. "Yes, sweetheart." Dorothy leaned closer, her smile practiced, her eyes unwavering even as dread curled in her stomach. "I feel funny," he whispered. His words were followed by a deep, racking cough that shook his whole body. Dorothy's hands flew to his shoulders, holding him upright as the fit seized him. His small fists clenched the blanket, knuckles white against the fabric, and for a horrifying moment, he couldn't draw breath. "Breathe with me," Dorothy urged, her voice steady even as panic clawed at her chest. "In and out. That's it. Slowly now." Mark gasped, his thin chest heaving as he fought to obey. The coughing subsided, leaving him slumped against her, utterly spent. She felt the warm dampness on her arm where his tears had soaked through her sleeve. "Sorry," he murmured, his head lolling against her shoulder. "I didn't mean to scare you." "Don't be silly." Dorothy pressed a kiss to his temple, the words automatic. "You don't scare me, kiddo." But he did. The truth sat like a stone in her gut. She saw it in the hollow spaces beneath his eyes, in the way his limbs felt like twigs when she held him. Something was stealing him from her, and no doctor's vague reassurances or hastily scribbled prescriptions had given her answers. Outside, the rain grew heavier, the rhythmic drumming matching her racing pulse. Mark's breathing grew uneven again, softer now, almost imperceptible. Her heart jolted. "Mark!" Her voice cracked. She shifted him so she could see his face. His eyes were half closed, his lips pale. He didn't respond. "Mark, wake up!" Her tone was sharper now, cutting through the suffocating stillness of the room. She shook him gently, her hands trembling. "Come on, baby. Look at me." No response. Dorothy felt her body move on autopilot, instincts taking over. She scooped him into her arms, his weight alarmingly slight, like carrying a bundle of fragile sticks. Ignoring the screaming protest of her own exhaustion, she wrapped an old coat around him and stumbled toward the door. The rain hit her like a wall, cold and unrelenting, but she didn't stop. Her shoes splashed through the pooling water on the uneven pavement as she half ran and half carried him down the street toward the hospital several blocks away. Each step jarred her arms aching as she clutched him tighter, whispering desperate promises against his ear. "We're almost there, Mark. Just hold on. Please hold on." Her vision blurred, not from the rain, but from the tears she refused to acknowledge. The hospital's harsh fluorescent lights came into view, a beacon cutting through the storm. As Dorothy pushed through the doors, soaking wet and breathless, she shouted for help, her voice raw. The nurses rushed forward, taking Mark from her arms and whisking him away before she could follow. She stood there, rooted in place, her body trembling, her drenched clothes clinging to her like a second skin. The waiting room loomed, cold and impersonal, as the rain outside continued to pour. Dorothy sank into a chair, her head in her hands. Her silent prayers were drowned out by the relentless drumming of the storm. The hospital room was unnaturally quiet, save for the muted hum of the machines that surrounded Mark's fragile body. Dorothy sat by his bedside, her fingers tracing the fine bones of his hand, memorizing the way they fit so perfectly within her own. The rhythmic beep of the monitor had been her only reassurance in this sterile, unforgiving space, a fragile tether that kept him connected to the world. But now, even that tether was slipping away. "Mum," Mark's voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. His eyes fluttered open, hazy and distant. "I'm tired." Dorothy leaned closer, her heart fracturing with every word. "I know, sweetheart. Just rest, okay? I'm right here. Will it stop hurting?" His question sliced through her like a blade. She couldn't lie, not to him, not now. "Soon," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm inside her. "You'll be able to sleep, and it won't hurt anymore." Mark's lips curled into a faint smile, the kind that could shatter her resolve. "Will there be rainbows?" he asked, his breath hitching with the effort. "Yes," Dorothy promised, choking back the sob that clawed at her throat. "All the colors. Just like you dreamed." His eyelids fluttered shut, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular movements. Dorothy clutched his hand tighter, her knuckles whitening with the effort to hold him here. But the monitor's beeps slowed, their rhythm faltering, until a long, piercing tone filled the room. "No," Dorothy whispered, her body tensing. She leaned over him, her hands shaking as she touched his face. "No! No! No! Mark, stay with me. Please, stay with me." The nurses rushed in, their practiced hands gently pulling her back. She fought against them, her voice rising, raw and desperate. "He's just tired. He needs a little more time." The doctor's expression told her everything she didn't want to hear. "I'm sorry, ma'am. He's gone." The words hung in the air, suffocating her. Dorothy sank into the chair by the bed, her body folding in on itself. She pressed her forehead against Mark's still chest, her tears soaking into the thin hospital gown. Time lost meaning as grief consumed her, swallowing her whole. Hours passed before they asked her to leave. She sat in silence as they explained the unpaid bills, their clipped tones contrasting starkly with her muted despair. The weight of her financial failure bore down on her like a physical force. She nodded numbly, barely registering their words. When the time came, she couldn't bear to leave Mark alone. She lingered, her hands trembling as she brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I wanted to give you so much more." A nurse gently guided her out, and the finality of the door closing behind her felt like the sound of her world shattering. The hospital administrator was waiting in the lobby, his polite but firm tone cut through her haze like a blade. "You still owe $3,142 for your son's care," he said, not unkindly, but with the weariness of someone who's had this conversation far too often. "We'll need a payment plan or—" He trailed off, allowing the unspoken threat to hang in the air. Dorothy clutched her threadbare coat tighter around her. "I don't have it," she said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. She stared at the man, daring him to push further. When he handed her a sheaf of papers, her fingers barely had the strength to hold them. That night, back at the small single-room apartment she had barely managed to afford, Dorothy sat surrounded by a lifetime's worth of meager possessions. The chair, with one leg propped up by a stack of books, the faded quilt her foster mother had left behind, the battered teapot Mark had used for imaginary tea parties when he was healthier. Everything suddenly felt useless, absurd in the face of what she had lost. By the next day, the apartment was stripped bare. A neighbor had taken the quilt for a few dollars. The chair was gone, sold to a man who didn't bother to haggle. Dorothy stuffed the teapot in her coat pocket, the only thing she couldn't bear to part with, and stepped out into the rain. The rain hadn't stopped since Mark's death. It came down in relentless sheets, cold and unforgiving, soaking through Dorothy's coat and chilling her to the bone. Her feet moved without direction, splashing through puddles that mirrored the dim streetlights. She passed indifferent strangers hurrying under umbrellas, their faces blurred by the downpour. The streets were dark and unfamiliar, illuminated only by the occasional street lamp casting its flickering light on the slick pavement. Dorothy clutched her worn coat around her, the cold seeping into her bones as rain began to fall. Her footsteps were slow and aimless, her mind lost in a haze of grief and exhaustion. She stopped at a storefront, the dim reflection of her haggard face staring back at her from the glass. Her once bright eyes were sunken, framed by the shadows of sleepless nights. The rain matted her hair to her face, and she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. With no home to return to and no reason to keep moving, Dorothy wandered. Memories of Mark haunted her with every step, the way his laughter used to fill the small apartment, the way he would curl up beside her on the sofa, his little hand resting on her arm. Those moments, once so ordinary, now felt like cruel taunts. The rain turned heavier, the kind that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Her shoes, already worn thin, soaked through, squelching with each step. Her legs trembled, her breaths shallow and uneven. She pressed a hand against a stone wall to steady herself, but the strength drained from her body like water through her fingers. She collapsed near an iron gate, her knees hitting the ground with a dull thud. The cold seeped into her skin, but she didn't move. For the first time, the emptiness inside her mirrored the world around her. The rain continued to fall, drenching her as she curled in on herself, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Through the haze of exhaustion and despair, Dorothy's gaze fell on the faint glow of a mansion beyond the gate. The windows shone with warmth, a stark contrast to the biting chill that enveloped her. But her body was too weak, her spirit too broken to move any closer. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the darkness. The rhythmic crunch of gravel under tires cut through the relentless drum of rain. Christopher Arnold tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His eyes narrowed against the storm as his car's headlights illuminated the winding driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, a beacon of light in the darkness, its tall windows glowing faintly through the downpour. He sighed, already anticipating the solitude that awaited him. As the car turned the final bend, something caught his eye. A shadow slumped by the wrought iron gate. At first, Christopher thought it might be an abandoned coat or debris washed down by the rain. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved into the outline of a person. He slowed the car to a crawl, his headlights cutting a stark beam across the scene. A woman lay crumpled near the gate, her figure barely visible beneath the sodden folds of a thin coat. Her hair clung to her face, plastered by the rain, and her arms were wrapped tightly around herself. For a long moment, Christopher sat frozen, his hand hovering over the gear shift. The storm outside was ferocious, and she looked half dead. He felt the instinctive tug of responsibility, tempered by years of guarded caution. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he pulled the car to the side and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and unforgiving, but he ignored it, his focus on the woman. Her breathing was shallow, and her lips were faintly blue. "Miss?" he called, his voice low but firm. When she didn't respond, he crouched beside her, his coat quickly soaking through. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered weakly, and a faint groan escaped her lips. She didn't move. Christopher hesitated. Bringing a stranger into his home, especially one in this condition, wasn't something he'd ever considered. But leaving her here in the cold, in this storm, it wasn't an option. The sharp memory of his father's voice echoed in his mind. "You don't ignore people in need, Christopher. It costs nothing to show humanity." Carefully, he slid his arms beneath her, surprised by how light she felt. Her soaked clothing clung to her fragile frame, and her head lolled against his chest as he carried her toward the house. Rain streamed off the eaves as he climbed the stone steps, the warmth of the entryway a stark contrast to the icy chill outside. Inside, the mansion was a world apart from the storm. The faint hum of central heating filled the air, accompanied by the soft crackle of a fireplace in the adjacent room. Christopher laid the woman on the leather couch in the study, her drenched coat leaving a dark stain on the cushions. He paused, unsure what to do next. "Teresa," he called, his voice echoing in the spacious hall. A housekeeper appeared moments later, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. "Mr. Arnold, who is this?" "I don't know," Christopher admitted. She was outside near the gate. "Get some towels and a blanket. She's freezing." Teresa hesitated but nodded, hurrying off. Christopher turned back to the woman, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest. Up close, her face was gaunt, the hollows of her cheeks accentuated by the dim light. She looked far younger than he'd first assumed, early 30s perhaps, but life had clearly worn her down. Teresa returned with a thick blanket and towels. Together they removed the woman's coat and wrapped her in warmth, careful not to disturb her. Christopher noticed a small, battered teapot peeking out of the coat pocket and set it aside without comment. "She needs a doctor," Teresa said softly. "She needs rest," Christopher replied. "We'll see how she is in the morning." Dorothy awoke to the sound of rain against the windows. The world swam into focus slowly, and her first sensation was warmth, a stark contrast to the icy cold she remembered. She blinked, disoriented, her eyes landing on the unfamiliar surroundings. Bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling, a roaring fire casting flickering light, and a man sitting in a leather chair, watching her. She bolted upright, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, edged with panic. "Easy," Christopher said, raising a hand in a gesture of calm. "You're safe. You were outside in the storm. I brought you here." Dorothy's gaze darted to the door, her body tense. "Why?" "You were half dead out there," Christopher replied simply. "I couldn't leave you." Her hands clutched the blanket tightly, suspicion flaring in her eyes. "I don't need charity." Christopher leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "This isn't charity. It's decency." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Dorothy studied him, searching for any hint of condescension or ulterior motives, but his face was calm, his tone matter-of-fact. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased. I didn't mean to end up here," she murmured, lowering her gaze. "I just needed to rest." "You've had more than a rough night," Christopher said gently, his voice softening. "Stay tonight. Rest. We'll figure things out tomorrow." Dorothy hesitated but nodded, too exhausted to argue further. As she leaned back against the couch, the fire's warmth lulling her into a fragile sense of security, she allowed herself, for the first time in days, to believe she might survive this storm. The soft clink of china echoed through the quiet living room as Christopher set down a delicate teacup on the low table between them. Dorothy sat opposite him, perched on the edge of a plush armchair that seemed too luxurious for someone like her. The crackling fireplace bathed the room in a golden glow, though Dorothy's fingers still trembled slightly as she gripped her cup, her body not yet fully warmed by the fire. She had stayed the night, too weak to refuse Christopher's insistence, but now the morning light streamed faintly through the tall windows, and reality weighed heavily on her shoulders. Christopher broke the silence first, his voice measured, almost tentative. "You seem like you've been through a lot." His words weren't probing, merely an invitation, but Dorothy stiffened nonetheless. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, her gaze darting to the door. The blanket he had given her still draped her lap, a stark reminder of her vulnerability. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," Christopher added, his tone neutral. "But sometimes it helps." Dorothy stared into the swirling tea in her cup, the steam rising like ghosts of memories she had tried to bury. Her fingers tightened around the handle. She didn't owe him anything, least of all her story. But the quiet compassion in his voice, steady, unassuming, was disarming. With a sharp exhale, she set her cup down. "I don't know why you care, but I guess it doesn't matter." Her voice was low, almost defiant, as if daring him to question her further. "I grew up in foster care. Never knew my parents. I just bounced from one house to the next until I was old enough to be on my own." Christopher didn't respond immediately, letting her words hang in the air. His calm demeanor felt less like indifference and more like an unspoken assurance that he was listening. Dorothy's voice softened, the tension in her shoulders ebbing slightly. "I thought, when I met Stephen, maybe I'd finally have something good. He was charming and funny, knew all the right things to say, and I was stupid enough to believe him." She laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the warm room. "When I told him I was pregnant, he didn't even hesitate, just walked out, said he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility." Christopher shifted slightly in his chair, but didn't interrupt. His steady gaze seemed to encourage her to continue. "Mark was everything to me," she said, her voice cracking on his name. "I worked every job I could find, barely slept. But it didn't matter because he made it worth it. He had this way of smiling, like nothing in the world could ever go wrong." Her hands trembled, and she pressed them into her lap, as if trying to steady herself. "But then he got sick. And no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried." Her voice faltered, tears welling in her eyes despite her best efforts. "I couldn't save him." The room fell silent, except for the faint crackle of the fire. Christopher leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "I'm sorry," he said simply, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her defenses like a balm. Dorothy looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. "Sorry doesn't fix anything," she said, but there was no anger in her tone, only exhaustion. "No, it doesn't," Christopher agreed. "But it doesn't mean what you've been through should go unheard." The rawness in his words surprised her. She studied him for a moment, noticing the lines around his eyes that hinted at his own burdens. "Why do you care?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Christopher hesitated, his jaw tightening as if debating how much to say. "You remind me of someone," he admitted. "My father. He made mistakes. One of them left someone out there who might have grown up feeling the way you did, lost, abandoned. He tried to fix it, but Well, life doesn't always give you that chance. Dorothy frowned. Her curiosity piqued despite herself. And now what? You're trying to make up for his mistakes. Christopher shook his head. No. I'm just trying to do what I can while I still have the chance. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of the teacup absently. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but something unspoken lingered. Thank you, she said quietly, surprising herself with the admission. For last night. For not leaving me out there. Christopher leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. Everyone deserves a little kindness, Dorothy, even when they don't think they do. The sound of the rain outside had softened, but its rhythm still echoed faintly against the window panes. Dorothy's eyes lingered on the fire, its warmth gradually seeping into her. For the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to believe, just a little, that maybe she wasn't entirely alone. The next morning, the soft patter of rain lingered as a faint backdrop to the quiet mansion. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table, absently wrapping her hands around a steaming mug of tea. Her thoughts were distant, the warmth of the tea only a slight comfort to the chill she still carried inside. Her attention shifted when a light, muffled cough came from the doorway. A little girl, no older than 6, stood hesitantly, her small hands clutching a stuffed rabbit. She had pale skin and dark circles under her eyes, as if sleep and vitality had been strangers to her for some time. Despite her frailty, her lips curled into a shy smile. "Hi," the girl said, her voice soft but cheerful. "Are you the lady Daddy helped last night?" Dorothy blinked, startled by the child's directness, and quickly composed herself. "I guess I am. And you must be his daughter." The girl nodded, stepping closer. "I'm Jenny, and this is Mr. Bun Bun." She lifted the stuffed rabbit slightly as though introducing an old friend. Dorothy couldn't help the faint smile tugging at her lips. "It's wonderful to meet you, Jenny. And Mr. Bun Bun, too." Jenny giggled softly before sitting across from Dorothy at the table, her small legs swinging. "You look tired," she observed, tilting her head. Dorothy hesitated, not sure how to respond. "It's been a long few days," she finally said, her voice subdued. Jenny didn't press further, her attention shifting to her rabbit. But as she moved, another cough racked her small frame, this one harsher and more forceful. Dorothy's smile faded, her brow furrowing as she instinctively reached out. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Jenny waved her off, her face momentarily red from the effort. "I'm fine. Just a little cold," she said between shallow breaths. But Dorothy recognized the signs. The faint wheeze in her breathing, the flush in her cheeks that wasn't from shyness. Her stomach twisted, memories of Mark's declining health flooding back unbidden. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus on the present. Before she could say more, Christopher entered the room, his presence commanding, but softened by the warmth in his eyes when he looked at Jenny. "I see you've met my daughter," he said, his voice carrying a hint of pride. Dorothy nodded, her gaze lingering on Jenny's pale complexion. "She seems sweet." "She is," Christopher said, ruffling Jenny's hair as he passed. "Though she's been under the weather lately. Doctor says it's nothing serious." Dorothy's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Experience had taught her how easily symptoms could be dismissed until it was too late. That night, Dorothy lay awake in the guest room, the quiet mansion amplifying the unease in her chest. The faint hum of the central heating was the only sound until a sharp, choking cough shattered the silence. Dorothy shot upright, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from down the hall. Without thinking, she threw on her robe and hurried toward the noise. She pushed open Jenny's door to find the little girl sitting up in bed, her face flushed and her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her small hands clutched her chest, panic flickering in her wide eyes. "Jenny!" Dorothy rushed to her side, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just try to breathe." "I can't," Jenny wheezed, tears pooling in her eyes. Dorothy's mind raced. She grabbed the inhaler from the bedside table, clearly prescribed but untouched, and gently coaxed Jenny to use it. Just a deep breath. "In and out," she murmured, her voice calm despite the knot of fear tightening in her stomach. It took several tense moments, but Jenny's breathing eventually steadied, the color slowly returning to her face. Dorothy let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, brushing damp strands of hair from the girl's forehead. "Better?" she asked gently. Jenny nodded, her eyes glassy. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small and tired. Christopher burst into the room then, his face pale with worry. "What happened?" he demanded, his eyes darting from Jenny to Dorothy. "She had a severe coughing fit," Dorothy explained, her voice steady. "I think it's more than just a cold, Christopher." Christopher looked at Jenny, his expression softening as he kneeled by her bedside. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Jenny nodded again, but Dorothy could see the exhaustion weighing heavily on her small frame. She met Christopher's gaze, her tone firm. "You need to take her to a doctor, a real specialist. This could be serious." Christopher hesitated, clearly torn between worry and denial. "Her doctor said—" "I've been here before," Dorothy interrupted, her voice low but resolute. "With my son. Please, Christopher, don't wait." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. Christopher searched her face, seeing the pain and conviction there, and finally nodded. "First thing in the morning," he promised. Dorothy exhaled, relief mixing with the ache in her chest. "What is the weather like where you live today? Leave your information in the comments section below. Hopefully, it will make you feel better, especially when listening to this story." She stayed by Jenny's side until the girl drifted back to sleep, her small hand curled around Dorothy's. As she sat there in the dim light, Dorothy couldn't help but think of Mark. The nights she had spent just like this, willing him to fight against the sickness that had claimed him. She stroked Jenny's hair gently, her resolve hardening. This time, she wouldn't let it end the same way. The storm had passed, leaving behind a misty stillness that mirrored her thoughts. Jenny was resting after her appointment with the specialist, but Dorothy's unease lingered. She had stayed close to the little girl all day, watching for the smallest signs of distress, her own memories of Mark never far from the surface. Behind her, Christopher entered the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He carried 2 glasses of whiskey, offering one to Dorothy without a word. She hesitated before taking it, the amber liquid catching the light. "Jenny's asleep," Christopher said, settling into one of the leather armchairs. His tone was calm, but his shoulders sagged under a weight that hadn't been there before. "The doctor's running more tests. It could be nothing, or it could be everything." Dorothy moved to sit opposite him, her fingers wrapping tightly around the glass. "You're worried," she said simply. Christopher nodded, his gaze distant. "She's all I have left." He paused, swirling the whiskey in his glass before taking a slow sip. "It's strange, isn't it? How life has a way of forcing you to confront things you thought you'd buried." Dorothy tilted her head, sensing the shift in his tone. "What do you mean?" Christopher leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The firelight played across his face, highlighting lines of tension she hadn't noticed before. "My father, George Arnold," he began, his voice quieter now, "was a complicated man, ambitious, ruthless even, but he wasn't infallible. He glanced at Dorothy, gauging her reaction, but she remained silent, waiting. Encouraged, he continued. When I was in my 20s, my father called me to his bedside. He was dying. Cancer. It was the first time I'd ever seen him vulnerable. He confessed to me that years before he'd had an affair. The woman left town when she found out she was pregnant. She didn't want anything from him, only to be left alone. And he let her go. Dorothy's brow furrowed, unsure where the story was leading, but a faint unease prickled at the edges of her thoughts. Christopher's voice grew heavier. He regretted it deeply. But by the time he tried to find her, it was too late. She'd disappeared, and the child, his child, was lost to us. He made me promise to find them, to set things right, but... He sighed, shaking his head. I tried. For years I searched. Private investigators, legal records, everything. But there was nothing. Dorothy's grip on her glass tightened. And you never found them? No, Christopher admitted. It's one of my greatest failures. I think about it often. What they might have endured, growing up without a father. Without anyone. He looked up at her, his gaze steady, but filled with regret. You remind me of them, in a way. The strength it must have taken to survive everything you've been through. It's not lost on me. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Dorothy's heart pounded, a strange mix of familiarity and disbelief creeping into her thoughts. She forced herself to shake it off. It couldn't be. Coincidences happened all the time. I don't see how I could remind you of someone you've never met, she said, her voice carefully measured. Christopher gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe it's just wishful thinking. Dorothy looked away, her gaze settling on the fire. She wanted to dismiss the story entirely, to file it away as something irrelevant to her life. But there was something in Christopher's voice, a quiet sincerity, that made it harder to ignore. Why are you telling me this? She asked finally. Christopher hesitated, his expression softening. Because I've spent too long keeping it to myself, and because I think it's important for you to know that people aren't always defined by their mistakes. My father was far from perfect, but his regrets taught me to try and do better, to hold on to the people I care about before it's too late. Dorothy felt a lump rise in her throat. The weight of his words pressed against her own grief, her own regrets. She swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to say anything, Christopher replied. Just know that if there's anything I can do, for you or Jenny, I'll do it. Dorothy met his gaze, her defenses softening despite herself. There was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. And though she didn't want to admit it, she felt a flicker of comfort in his words. Thank you, she said, quietly, the words feeling heavier than she expected. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe, however fleetingly, that maybe not everyone was destined to leave her behind. The air in Dr. Collins's office was heavy with the sterile scent of antiseptics and quiet urgency. Christopher sat stiffly across from the doctor, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Dorothy sat beside him, her shoulders squared and her gaze fixed on Jenny, who lay in a hospital bed just visible through the glass partition. Monitors beeped softly, their rhythms a constant reminder of time slipping away. Dr. Collins cleared his throat, drawing their attention. He was a meticulous man, with sharp, tired eyes, his movements brisk, but deliberate. Jenny's condition has worsened since her last visit, he said, flipping through a chart. Her organs are under severe strain, and we're running out of options. Without a compatible donor, I'm afraid the prognosis is grim. Christopher's jaw tightened. "How much time are we talking?" Dr. Collins hesitated. "Weeks, if we're lucky. Days, if the deterioration accelerates." The words hit Christopher like a physical blow, but he maintained his composure. "What are her chances of finding a donor in time?" Dr. Collins sighed, setting the chart down. "It's rare to find a match quickly. We've expanded the search, but we need to consider other possibilities." "What about me?" Christopher asked, leaning forward. "I'll be tested." Dr. Collins shook his head. "We already have your results from earlier tests. Unfortunately, you're not compatible." A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the soft hum of the monitors. Dorothy shifted in her chair, her fingers digging into her knees. Finally she spoke, her voice steady but quiet. "Test me." Both men turned to her, startled. "Dorothy," Christopher began, his voice tinged with concern. "You don't have to—" "I do," she interrupted, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "I've seen what this illness can do. I can't just stand by and watch her suffer." Dr. Collins studied her for a moment before nodding. "It's a simple blood test. We can have the results back within a few hours." The waiting felt endless. Christopher paced the length of the corridor, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiles. Dorothy sat near the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the rain streaking down the glass. Neither spoke, the weight of possibility pressing down on them. Finally, Dr. Collins returned, his expression unreadable. Christopher stopped pacing, his breath catching as the doctor held out a folded sheet of paper. "It's a match," Dr. Collins said simply. Dorothy exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging with a mix of relief and apprehension. Christopher, however, remained frozen, the words replaying in his mind. He took the paper with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the numbers and medical jargon that confirmed what they had hoped for, and what he now feared. "Remarkable," Dr. Collins added. "The compatibility is almost perfect. Statistically, it's incredibly rare, especially for an unrelated donor." The words lingered in the air, sharpening the unease that had been building in Christopher since the moment he met Dorothy. He glanced at her, studying her face, her strong features, the subtle tilt of her chin, the determination in her eyes. Memories of his father's confession resurfaced, intertwining with a gnawing suspicion he couldn't shake. "Thank you, Dorothy," Christopher said, his voice quieter now. "You don't know what this means to me." Dorothy nodded, her expression guarded. "It's not about you, it's about her." Later that evening, as Jenny rested under the watchful eyes of the nursing staff, Christopher stood in his study, holding the DNA test kit his assistant had delivered earlier. He turned the small vial over in his hands, his mind racing. The match was too perfect. The timelines, the details, it all aligned in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like fate. He thought of his father's child, lost to time and circumstance. Could Dorothy be the answer to the question that had haunted him for years? The weight of what he was about to do settled heavily on his chest. He wasn't proud of the secrecy, but he couldn't ignore the possibility. Carefully, he placed the vial into the testing envelope, sealing it with a resolve that left little room for doubt. "I'm sorry, Dorothy," he murmured to the empty room, "but I need to know." The following morning, Dorothy sat beside Jenny's bed, stroking the little girl's hair as she slept. The machines beeped softly, their cadence no longer as erratic as before. Dorothy's heart ached as she watched Jenny's frail form, her mind drifting back to Mark. She remembered his small, labored breaths, and the way he had fought so hard even when the odds were stacked against him. "I'm not going to let you go through this alone," she whispered, more to herself than to Jenny. "Not if I can help it." Christopher entered quietly, his expression composed but his thoughts elsewhere. "Dorothy," he began, his voice gentle. "Thank you for everything." She glanced up, her gaze wary but steady. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." "No," Christopher said firmly. "You're doing more than that." Dorothy looked away, the weight of her own loss pressing against her chest. "Let's just focus on getting her better." Christopher nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. The DNA test results wouldn't arrive for another day, but he knew, deep in his gut, that they would confirm what he suspected. And when they did, everything would change. The envelope sat unopened on Christopher's desk, an unassuming white square against the polished wood. The room was silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock, each second a reminder of the decision he had yet to make. His hands hovered over the envelope, trembling slightly as he debated whether to confirm the truth he already felt in his heart. With a sharp inhale, he broke the seal and pulled out the papers. His eyes scanned the lines of text, the clinical jargon blurring until he reached the conclusion. Probability of biological sibling relationship, 99.8%. Christopher leaned back in his chair, the words ringing in his mind. Dorothy was his half-sister, the child his father had lost. The realization filled him with a complex wave of emotions, relief, awe, and a deep, almost primal need to protect her. Later that morning, Christopher stood by Jenny's bedside, watching Dorothy as she gently stroked the little girl's hair. Jenny's breathing was steadier now, the machines beeping in a calm rhythm. Dorothy's presence had become a source of comfort for both of them, her quiet strength grounding the storm of uncertainty. "Christopher," Dorothy said softly, glancing up at him, "the doctors want to schedule the surgery soon. They said, the sooner we act, the better her chances." Christopher nodded, his throat tightening. He had been dreading this moment, knowing it would force him to confront his growing guilt. Dorothy had already offered so much, her willingness to undergo surgery, her compassion for Jenny, and now the truth threatened to complicate everything. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. "There's still time to reconsider." Dorothy's eyes hardened slightly. "I've already made my decision. Jenny needs this. That's all that matters." Christopher swallowed hard, unable to hold her gaze. The DNA results were like a weight pressing on his chest, their significance growing heavier with each passing moment. He wanted to tell her, to share the truth and unburden himself, but the fear of her reaction stopped him. What if she refused the surgery? What if she left, unable to process the revelation? The stakes were too high. For Jenny's sake, the truth would have to wait. The hours before the surgery passed in a haze of preparation. Nurses moved briskly around Dorothy, explaining the procedure and double-checking her consent forms. Christopher watched from the hallway, his hands buried in his pockets as his mind churned with conflicting emotions. Dorothy was calm, almost unnervingly so. She smiled faintly at Jenny, who clung to Mr. Bun-Bun with a quiet intensity. "You're going to feel so much better soon," Dorothy said, her voice soft but firm. "You'll be able to run and play again. No more being stuck in bed." Jenny nodded, her wide eyes betraying her fear. "Will it hurt?" Dorothy shook her head. "Not for long. And I'll be here the whole time. Okay?" Christopher felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the exchange. Dorothy's maternal instincts were undeniable. Her love and care for Jenny, palpable. It wasn't just selflessness driving her. It was something deeper, something tied to her own pain and loss. As the nurses wheeled Jenny away, Dorothy turned to Christopher. "Take care of her while I'm under," she said, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. Christopher nodded, unable to speak. He wanted to tell her how much she meant to him, how grateful he was, not just for what she was doing for Jenny, but for the person she was. but the words caught in his throat, too heavy with the secret he carried. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're incredible," he said simply. Dorothy gave him a faint smile. "Let's just make sure she gets better." Alone in the waiting room, Christopher sat with his head in his hands. The DNA results felt like a ticking clock in his mind, counting down to the moment when Dorothy would know the truth. He replayed their conversations, searching for the right words to tell her. But every scenario ended the same way, with uncertainty, with fear. "She deserves to know," he muttered to himself, the words barely audible over the hum of the hospital. Dr. Collins appeared in the doorway, his expression neutral but focused. "We're ready to begin," he said. "You can stay here, or you can join Jenny in the observation area." Christopher stood, his legs heavy. "I'll stay with Jenny." As the surgery began, Christopher sat by Jenny's side, his hand gently brushing her small fingers. The hum of machines and the sterile light of the room felt distant, his thoughts consumed by Dorothy. The weight of the truth pressed on him, but so did the enormity of what Dorothy was about to do. She had stepped into their lives as a stranger. Yet, she was giving them everything. And now she wasn't just a stranger. She was family. His sister. The word felt foreign, yet comforting, a missing piece he hadn't known he was searching for. He resolved then and there that when the time was right, when Jenny was safe and Dorothy had recovered, he would tell her. He would make things right. For now, he would wait and pray. The operating rooms were stark, bathed in sterile white light. The air buzzed with quiet intensity as the medical teams prepared for the delicate procedure. In one room, Jenny lay motionless, her small frame dwarfed by the surrounding machines. In the adjacent room, Dorothy was similarly prepped, the hum of monitors and whispered instructions filling the space. Christopher stood behind the glass in the observation area, his hands pressed against the cold surface as he watched the surgeons in Jenny's room. A nurse had offered him a chair, but sitting felt impossible. His heart pounded, a relentless rhythm that echoed the tension in his chest. In Jenny's operating room, Dr. Collins directed the team with calm precision. "Vitals are stable. Begin prepping for graft insertion." The surgeon next to him nodded, his gloved hands moving with practiced efficiency. The intricate process of preparing Jenny's frail body to accept Dorothy's organ had begun. Christopher's eyes flicked between Jenny and the connecting corridor where Dorothy was being operated on simultaneously. In Dorothy's room, the atmosphere was no less intense. The lead surgeon leaned over her unconscious form, his voice steady. "We need to move quickly. Her vitals are solid, but we can't afford complications." The team worked in silence, extracting the healthy tissue needed for the transplant. Dorothy's body, despite its strength of will, was already showing signs of strain. Her blood pressure dipped momentarily, drawing a sharp murmur from the anesthesiologist, but it stabilized again after adjustments. The minutes stretched into an agonizing hour. For Christopher, each tick of the clock felt like a lifetime. He forced himself to stay focused on Jenny, her small face peaceful despite the chaos of the room. "Graft ready," Dr. Collins announced. "Let's proceed." The process of transplanting Dorothy's tissue into Jenny began in earnest, the room tense but orderly. Machines beeped steadily, a mechanical soundtrack to the life-saving effort. But in Dorothy's room, the situation took a sudden, terrifying turn. "BP's dropping," a nurse called, her voice breaking the calm. The lead surgeon looked up sharply. "We've got arrhythmia. Prepare to defibrillate." Dorothy's heart monitor showed an erratic line, and then flatline. "Cardiac arrest," another voice said, urgent but controlled. The surgical team sprang into action, the tension thick in the room. Christopher couldn't see what was happening, but the sudden shift in the atmosphere was palpable even from the observation area. He turned toward the connecting corridor, his stomach knotting. "What's going on in there?" he demanded, but no one could answer. In Dorothy's room, the team fought to revive her. The defibrillator paddles charged, the sharp command of "clear" ringing out as they pressed them to her chest. Her body jerked with the jolt, but the monitor remained silent. Another attempt. Then another. "Come on, Dorothy," the surgeon muttered under his breath, sweat beading on his forehead. Back in Jenny's room, Dr. Collins glanced toward the corridor. He couldn't leave his post, but the tension of the situation was clear in the tight line of his jaw. "How's the graft holding?" he asked, his voice firmer now. "Graft is stable," one of the surgeons confirmed. "No signs of rejection so far." "Good," Collins replied. "Let's focus on keeping it that way." Christopher's relief at Jenny's progress was overshadowed by the gnawing fear for Dorothy. He clenched his fists, his thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and desperation. She can't die. Not like this. Not after everything she's done. Finally, in Dorothy's room, a faint blip echoed through the monitor. The line on the screen steadied, her heartbeat weak but present. The team collectively exhaled, their hands moving quickly to stabilize her condition. "She's back," the surgeon said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Let's close up and monitor closely. She's at high risk." Dorothy's body lay still, her face pale, but her heart continued to beat. Yet she didn't wake. Hours later, Christopher sat in the waiting room, his face buried in his hands. Dr. Collins approached, his expression a mix of relief and gravity. "Jenny's surgery was a success," he said. "She's in recovery, and her body is already showing signs of improvement. The graft is holding." Christopher looked up, his eyes filled with unspoken gratitude. "And Dorothy?" Dr. Collins hesitated. "She's alive, but she's in a coma. It's impossible to say how long she'll remain unconscious. We'll need to monitor her closely over the next few days." The words hit Christopher like a blow, the weight of his earlier choices pressing down on him with renewed force. He nodded slowly, his throat too tight to speak. That evening, Christopher sat by Jenny's bedside, her small hand resting in his. She was still pale, but her breathing was steady, her chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. He thought of Dorothy, lying in the ICU, her life hanging by a thread because she had chosen to save a child who wasn't even hers. He whispered into the quiet room, his voice trembling. "You've done more than anyone could ask, Dorothy. I won't let you go through this alone." The sterile stillness of the hospital morning was interrupted by a faint, sleepy voice. "Daddy?" Christopher jerked upright in his chair, his heart pounding as Jenny's eyes fluttered open. Her pale face broke into a weak smile, and her small fingers tightened around his hand. Relief surged through him, tears stinging his eyes as he leaned closer. "Jenny," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You're awake." She nodded slightly, her movements slow but deliberate. "What happened?" "You're going to be okay," Christopher said gently, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "The surgery worked. You're going to get stronger now." Jenny blinked at him, her gaze drifting to the stuffed rabbit tucked beside her. "Did the lady help me? Dorothy?" Christopher swallowed hard, his emotions catching him off guard. "Yes, sweetheart," he said softly. "Dorothy helped you. She's the reason you're here with me now." A flicker of curiosity crossed Jenny's face. "Why did she help me?" Christopher hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing on him. He had spent the past few days grappling with how to tell Dorothy, but Jenny's innocent question brought clarity. She deserved to know the truth too. "Because she's family, Jenny," Christopher said, his voice steady. Dorothy is your aunt. She's my sister." Jenny's eyes widened, and for a moment she was silent. Then a small, delighted smile spread across her face. "Really? She's like me." Christopher nodded, his heart swelling. "Yes, sweetheart. She's like you, and she loves you very much." Dorothy's room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the machines that monitored her fragile condition. Her face was pale, her body still, but the faint rise and fall of her chest was a lifeline that kept Christopher going. He sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The DNA results lay folded in his pocket, a constant reminder of the secret he had kept. Now, as he looked at her, fragile but alive, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. "Dorothy," he said softly, his voice trembling, "you've already done so much for us, more than I could ever repay. But there's something you need to know." Her eyelids fluttered faintly, a small groan escaping her lips. Christopher's heart leaped as her fingers twitched, her hand moving slightly beneath the thin blanket. "Dorothy?" he said, leaning closer. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, but gradually locking onto his. "Christopher?" Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. "I'm here," he said, his relief spilling over in a quiet laugh. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." Dorothy's brow furrowed as she tried to sit up, but Christopher gently pressed her back down. "Don't try to move too much," he said. "You need to rest." She blinked at him, her confusion evident. "Jenny." "She's fine," Christopher assured her. "The surgery was a success. She's awake, and she's getting stronger." Dorothy exhaled, her body relaxing against the pillow. "Thank God," she murmured. Christopher hesitated, his chest tight with emotion. "Dorothy, there's something I need to tell you." Her eyes found his, searching. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out the folded DNA results. His hands trembled as he placed the paper on the bed beside her. "You're my sister, Dorothy. My half-sister. My father. He made mistakes, and you were one of the things he lost along the way. But you're not lost anymore." Dorothy stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment she said nothing, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. Then, tears welled in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Christopher said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just know that you're not alone anymore. You have family, Dorothy. Me, Jenny. We're your family." Her lips trembled, and she reached out weakly, her hand finding his. "I've been alone for so long," she said, her voice breaking. I didn't think this was possible." Christopher clasped her hand tightly, tears streaming down his face. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "We'll get through this together." Later that day, Jenny was wheeled into Dorothy's room, her small face lighting up when she saw her. "Dorothy!" she cried, her voice full of excitement. Dorothy's eyes softened, her hand reaching out for Jenny. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, her voice still weak but filled with warmth. Jenny took her hand, holding it tightly. "Daddy told me you're my aunt," she said with a big smile. "That means we're family." Dorothy's tears returned, but this time they were tears of joy. "Yes, Jenny," she said softly. "We're family." Christopher stood by the door, watching the two of them with a heart full of gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The fractures of his past were healing, replaced by the bonds of a new beginning. The three of them embraced, the moment heavy with love and relief. They had faced loss, pain, and uncertainty, but now together they had found something worth holding on to. A family. Months later, the sun dipped low over the sprawling gardens of the Arnold estate, casting a warm golden glow on the gathered crowd. Guests mingled under a large white canopy, their faces reflecting a mix of anticipation and hope. At the center of it all stood Christopher and Dorothy, side by side, their bond unmistakable. Both looked toward the stage, where a banner proudly announced the opening of the Mark Arnold Foundation. The foundation was Christopher's idea, but Dorothy had shaped its heart. Dedicated to researching rare illnesses and providing resources for families in crisis, the foundation was a tribute to the boy who had inspired Dorothy's resilience and determination. Mark's name was etched into every facet of its mission. Dorothy stepped forward to the podium, her posture still slightly fragile, but her voice steady. The crowd quieted as she adjusted the microphone, her eyes scanning the faces before her. Jenny sat in the front row, clutching Mr. Bun-Bun, her smile radiant and her health visibly restored. "Thank you all for being here," Dorothy began, her voice carrying a warmth that drew everyone in. "Today is about more than just launching a foundation. It's about remembering the ones we've loved and lost, and ensuring their legacy lives on." She paused, her hands gripping the podium as she took a breath. "Mark was my son," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He was bright, kind, and full of dreams. But his life was cut short by a rare illness we didn't understand and couldn't fight in time. Losing him nearly broke me. But it also gave me a purpose. No family should have to face what we did without support, without hope." Her gaze flickered to Christopher, who nodded in quiet encouragement. "This foundation," she continued, "isn't just for Mark. It's for every child who deserves a chance at life, and for every parent who needs to know they're not alone. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can give hope." The audience erupted into applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. Christopher joined Dorothy at the podium, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than honor Mark's memory," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "You've created a legacy that will save lives." Later, as the sun set and the guests mingled around the gardens, Jenny approached Dorothy with a folded piece of paper in her small hands. "Aunt Dorothy," she said shyly, tugging at her dress, "I made this for you." Dorothy kneeled carefully, her knees still weak but steady enough to meet Jenny at eye level. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked, taking the paper. Unfolding it, she found a colorful drawing. At the center stood three figures, Dorothy, Christopher and Jenny, holding hands under a bright sun. Beside them, drawn with a delicate, childlike reverence, was another figure, Mark. Above them, Jenny had written, "Our family." Dorothy's breath caught, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She pulled Jenny into a gentle hug, holding her close. "Thank you, Jenny," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This is the most beautiful gift I've ever received." Jenny smiled against her shoulder. "We're a family now. That means Mark is too." Christopher stepped closer, his eyes soft as he looked at the drawing. "She's right," he said quietly. "He's always going to be a part of us." As the evening wound down, the three of them strolled through the garden, the soft glow of lanterns lighting their path. Dorothy walked slowly, her hand resting on Christopher's arm for support, while Jenny skipped ahead, her laughter filling the air. "I never imagined my life could feel this full," Dorothy said, her voice tinged with wonder. "After everything, I thought I'd always be alone." Christopher shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "None of us are meant to be alone, Dorothy. It just takes time to find the people who truly belong in our lives." Dorothy smiled, the warmth of his words settling deep in her heart. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "No," he said, firmly. Thank you. You didn't just save Jenny. You saved me too. This family, it wouldn't exist without you. Jenny ran back to them then, grabbing their hands and pulling them forward. Come on, let's go see the lights, she exclaimed, her energy infectious. The three of them walked hand in hand, the lanterns casting a soft glow over their path. Above them, the first stars of the evening began to twinkle, as if the universe itself was offering its blessing. For the first time in years, Dorothy felt complete. She had found a family, a purpose, and a way to honor Mark's memory in a way that would endure. And as they walked into the future, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.